Welcome back, Wanderers, to another episode of the Corner of Story and Game. Today we're going to dig into 4 more lenses from The Art of Game Design, the well-known textbook by Jesse Schell. As an unexpected treat, I was able to convince Will Shen to sit down and go through these lenses with me. Now, in case you missed his previous episode, Will is the lead content designer at Something Wicked Games, working on their upcoming title, Wordsong. Before that, he was the former design director at Bethesda Game Studios, contributing to iconic titles such as Starfield, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76. In this episode of the series, we're going to take a look at the lenses of endogenous value, problem solving, the 8 filters, and functional space, all of which can be brought to bear on Will's specialty. So, Will, thank you for joining me. Dude, I'm going to have you back again someday, don't worry.
Sure.
But I am really excited because I managed to convince you to sit down and chat with me for the series I'm doing on the art of game design, the lenses from Jesse Schell's book. And today we've picked 4 lenses. We've got the lens, and I'm going to kill this word at some point, I'm sure, but the lens of endogenous value. Let's get right off the start.
Yeah, everyone has to look up that word. Yeah.
The lens of problem solving, the lens of the 8 filters, which is a big one, but we're going to condense it, and the lens of functional space. Now, we picked these 4 because they can be applied very specifically to level design, quest design, really hard game design stuff, which is right up your wheelhouse. This is what you shine at. Like, you do a lot of stuff, but so you're the perfect guy for this. But before we dig into the lenses, for people who didn't hear the previous episode, let's introduce Will. So Will, how did you fall in love with gaming? How did you fall in love with the career? How'd you get into the career? And what brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I got into game design because I was actually a technical writer, and a local game studio was offering a game design internship that was primarily just a lot of documentation work. And that ended up being Bethesda Game Studios, where I worked on Fallout 3. Then they kicked me out and then brought me back for Skyrim. And I worked there for almost 15 years and was promoted up to design director before I left after Starfield. So I'm currently at Something Wicked Games, which is a startup founded by ex-Bethesda and Obsidian developers and leadership. And we're working on our first project, Wordsong.
Excellent. Someday I want to talk to someone about Wordsong, but it's in progress. We can't talk, but I'm so excited to watch that, to see what comes out there, but not today. Not today. All right, well, let's jump into the first of our lenses, endogenous value. I nailed it. All right. So, Will, can you introduce for everybody the concept of endogenous value and its significance in digital game design?
Sure. The basic idea is that there are things in the game that are valuable only within the game itself. A high score, for example, experience points, gold coins that you use to buy things in the game. And the interesting thing about game design is that we could easily give you all the gold, all the experience points, give you the max high score as soon as you boot up the game, but then no one would want that. The joy of a game is that you feel like progress is earned. So it's not just about having the highest number, it's that every time the number goes up, it needs to feel like it went up because of you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a really interesting point that's really important to hammer home, because I think of like 7 Days to Die, I want to say, as a survival game. I used to play and love it, and then I realized there were codes you can enter where you can give yourself all the skills and you can level yourself all up. And as soon as you do that, the game kind of isn't fun anymore. And it's like, why would I play it now? Like, so there is something very psychological about that endogenous value.
Yeah, exactly. You want achievement, but if the achievement doesn't feel earned, then it loses its value. And that's part of the fact that it's endogenous, right? It's closed within the system. Your high score is meaningless outside of the game. So if you don't feel a sense of achievement and progress as you're getting that score, it's not like you can take the score and transfer it to your ATM, or that it has some other value outside of the closed circuit of the game.
Although there are some NFT people who try and convince you there's a way to do that. So.
There are interesting things being done in that space, to try to do that. And I mean, the classic one, of course, being betting on things like sports. Right. The score of the football game doesn't matter outside of the game itself, except in the case of we're going to be putting money on it. And there are other rewards, of course, the Super Bowl sponsorships, things that have value outside of just the game.
Right. Okay, well, let's bring that to focus on level design, quest design, actual game mechanics. How does the consideration of endogenous value influence the way Will approaches level and quest designs?
So the weirdest thing about quest design is that the most valuable thing in the game becomes the checklist. There's a surprising amount of value in the experience of I've completed the task and I've crossed it off. This is probably why cleaning simulator games have gotten so popular, because there's a definitive state of it is done. And that complete lack of ambiguity that it's finished is very satisfying. So quests are about doing things and being told that they're finished on some level. There are other factors, but that is a huge part of the reward of doing a thing the game tells you to do. And then level design-wise, the placement of activities, objects, and specifically loot in the space is the big thing. When does the player get the stuff? How is the stuff paced out so it feels like you're burning it? And does the overall sense of pacing feel like we're going through the experience at a good clip and that it's not frustrating, you're not getting lost? That's how you can use that to approach your level design.
Nice. There's a lot of talk about closing the loop. Like, you design a quest, the person gets the quest, goes on the quest, there's twists and turns, you close it, you have that sense like you're talking about, that sense of finality, the sense of finishing it. I'm curious, how long can you leave a loop open? Could you start something early in the game and leave it open while everything else is happening and close it late? Or does it need to close sooner?
Oh, you can leave it open almost indefinitely. So a great example of this are the Zelda games, right? The recent ones, like Breath of the Wild. There's that task right at the beginning. You've got to defeat Ganon. And it's just left open. At some point, you have to defeat Ganon and save the day. But it's sort of up to you when you want to approach that. But you know that at some point that is what has to be done. Or maybe you get lost for 40 hours and then you stop playing because you have to do things. But that is an indefinite open task that when you complete it, some aspect of the game is over. Right. So you can leave the circuit open for a really, really long period of time, depending on what it is.
What's the advantage to setting the stage with a big open long-term one as opposed to tight ones like World of Warcraft is very famous for the tight, closed loops?
Yeah, the benefit of the open loop is that the player feels like they have a sense of agency in how they approach it, because you know that you could just rush to Ganon and fight him and potentially win. Probably not if you're just starting, but some people do, right? There are people who've mastered the game that can speed run it. That is a sense of freedom. The game's not telling me what to do. I'm deciding when to do this thing the game is letting me know exists as its end state. The advantage of small, tight loops is a sense of accomplishment and progress. So, there's the famous story of why are there quests in World of Warcraft? And that is because the people who designed the World of Warcraft quest were EverQuest fans. And in the original EverQuest, there is no content. You just fight things and level up, and you sort of have to make your own fun, which is great, except when you add in quests and story content, you feel like you're making your way through a space and you're being rewarded for little achievements that you're doing throughout the experience. So that's the two sides of the coin. You either have an open task that gives the player a really big feeling of agency, or you have a lot of small, kind of almost hand-holdy tasks and assignments that give you a sense of completion and progress.
Brilliant, buddy. Brilliant. Okay, before we put a pin in this one,
Sure.
Just to put you on the spot, can you think of an example or an experience from your history where endogenous value influenced something you created? Yeah, I didn't prep you for that one.
That's fine. I'm trying to think. I think the main thing that immediately jumps to mind for all the Bethesda titles was all of the discussions we would have every time over how much stuff to put in every level. We would come up with a new metric almost every project. It usually ended up being the same metric because there's only so much stuff you want to pick up before you get fatigued. Mm-hmm. But that is an example of thinking about things in terms of value when you're setting up the space. You know, at some level, a lot of the open world games are about, I'm going to explore a space and loot things. So how much loot is in the area that feels satisfying and not too much or too little?
That's a great example. I was playing Baldur's Gate 3 the other day, and I'm the guy who picks up every piece of silverware and every wheel of cheese. And at some point, it's like, that's really got no value, but I'm still doing it.
Yeah, and it bogs you down.
Yep.
I'm essentially extending the game by several hours because now I have to manage the inventory and encumbrance and buy and sell stuff, and I already have all the gold. So why am I doing this?
Yeah.
But it's satisfying. It's satisfying in some way intrinsic to you.
Exactly. All right, well, let's move on. We could keep going on that forever. The next one is the lens of problem solving. So applying the idea of problem solving when it comes to designing a level or a quest. So how does this lens shape the challenges that the players face within that level or quest?
So this is an interesting one because I think that in a good game, players are actually solving the same problem over and over again. There's always a temptation in design to constantly want to introduce new problems to solve, but we tend to forget that actual problem solving as a human being is really hard. You have to stop and think, and you have to experiment, and you'll fail a lot of times when you're learning, which then leads to frustration. So then we go back as designers and say, okay, let's introduce tutorials and do difficulty curves and do variations of the same problems so that the player develops mastery. So a recent example of this, the God of War games, for example, are great, but they have this hit 3 symbol puzzle that they use to open up like a chest. Mm-hmm. And they do variations where sometimes one of the symbols is hidden, or you have to use one of your tools to, free it from some bind or constriction. But ultimately, it's the find 3 symbols problem over and over again. But if it was a completely different puzzle system every time, that would not only take a long time to make because you'd be making a new system every single time, but it would also be frustrating because as a player, you would never get good at it. As soon as you've figured out one puzzle, boom, all of a sudden it's a completely new, different puzzle, the whole different schema. And even games that are centered around problem solving, like say strategy games or even like specific puzzle games, like the puzzle is the main experience, they tend to build on problem sets. They introduce a way of solving a puzzle and they build off of that for a while before they introduce a new one. Uh-huh. So you have to always keep in mind, how are we going to pace out a new problem and make sure that the player isn't just hitting their head against the wall and then they give up.
You make it sound like the lens of mastery, which is another lens in the book, is very applicable here. The idea that as you develop mastery of that problem set, the problem set can then scale up in difficulty or add more things onto it.
Yeah, exactly. Those two lenses sort of work in tandem because at some point you have to say, we have done this problem to death, right? It has reached the point where we can't think of anything new to do and it is rote and so it's boring. But where that is a really hard question. That's the art of it. And it could be a lot later than you think. There are some activities that are fun because they become rote and you get into sort of a flow state. Right. So it's easy to overestimate the need for novelty, but you have to have some sense of novelty or else you get bored.
Right. So all of this has a direct impact on player engagement then. Like you can tweak the problem solving in order to change how much they're engaged.
Yeah, exactly. And again, there's no right answer. People's tastes and the audience tastes and even your audience are all constantly changing.
Right.
So if it feels like you're tackling the same problem every time you start a new project is because you are.
So, something that comes to mind I want to pick your brain on, and only because the Destiny 2 season's coming to an end, and so I'm trying to clear out all my old quests. There's a quest where you're trying to get the exotic rifle outbreak perfected, and you have to go really fast, but there's a really complicated puzzle in the middle of it. So you're problem solving on a rather strategic, difficult level while in action. So where do you stand on the idea of throwing complicated problems in the midst of frantic action?
That's interesting because, well, I've worked on a lot of games that had a lot of freedom. So it was a lot harder to create pressure scenarios because the player could just leave. I think maybe the only example I have from memory is in Starfield, there's a sequence where you have an enemy that you can't really defeat. You kind of can, but you're not supposed to. We really stack it. And we're putting a lot of pressure on you to run away and get somewhere safe. And that is incredibly hard. You know, the players always want, well, I don't want to say players always want, but there is sort of a natural inclination both to mess with the design, to not do the thing you're being forced to do when when it feels like you're being forced. And when you're trying to introduce a restricted scenario, whenever you have a game that is more about freedom, it feels wrong, you know, and so a lot of effort had to go into making it feel like, okay, this scenario is against the normal rules of the game. This is a special case, and it's okay that we're leading you by the nose a little more than we would otherwise. But that ended up taking a lot more effort because you're sort of changing the tone and tenor of the game in that way. So you can absolutely use time and other things as pressure, but I think I go back to my original point of every game is introducing sets of problems that we then are asking you to solve over and over again. And you have to be careful about introducing it in a new context. And that if you then introduce another element to it, like time pressure or some other thing, or like a kill box, you know, if you go outside the bounds and that's a new rule that you're introducing, you have to be careful about introducing that so that people both don't feel frustrated, but also don't feel like you've suddenly changed the game on them.
Right. That's important to remember. Good point. I'm curious, just because there's a part of our audience that works in tabletop and I like to make things kind of applicable to everybody. This problem-solving lens is very also applicable to designing adventures for tabletop role-playing or running your home game. And when you start talking about leading people away and making them run from scary things, that's something DMs do all the time. How do you feel in your experience playing or running tabletop? Because I know you've done some. How do you think this applies to that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very similar situation where if you're trying to introduce something new as either a tabletop designer or as a game master, you have to be careful about introducing something new that completely changes the prior established rules and problems. You're always trying to build a bridge to something that's new. That's why we inevitably go back in game development and add things like tutorials or explanations, or in tabletop, it would be considered maybe a different phase of the game or a different system. Right. Like if you were adding, say, a whole survival system into Dungeons and Dragons, you would probably introduce that as a separate advanced rule with its own explanation. And you would have to sit down with your group and say, hey, in this campaign, we're going to be using this new advanced survival rule set, and your expectations need to be recalibrated a bit. You're not going to just be able to, go into to the dungeon on an empty stomach and not worry about food.
Right.
We're actually going to track hunger and things like that. You can't just like throw that in the middle of a campaign or a game that is doing something else.
Right.
So you're always worried about how you introduce new things and ramp people up to them.
Pathfinder had an adventure path called Kingmaker that did exactly that. They tacked on a whole separate rule set about kingdom building.
Yeah.
Some people loved it. Some people didn't. Some people are like, I'm here to play D&D. What is this kingdom building sim that you suddenly are making me play? So it is important to be aware of what experience you're going into.
Yeah, exactly. And I really liked Kingmaker. I thought that was so clever. And I think all the Paizo Pathfinder adventure sets did a great job of introducing new things, because if they didn't have anything and it was just an adventure, that's probably fine. But at the same time, you're paying them for a premium tabletop product, and you want them to be introducing something new into the space, so it feels like you and your team are getting a unique experience to the money that you put in for it. So I think it's not going to obviously be to everyone's taste, and it's good to make sure that you kind of go over it with the group, up front, so that no one's being surprised. But I think it's really good that they really went for that sense of novelty for each one of those.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, let's move on to the next lens.
Sure.
This is the big one, the lens of 8 filters. So just quickly, the 8 filters are artistic, impulse, demographics, experience design, innovation, business and marketing, engineering, social, and playtesting. Now, these are lumped together because they're used as a way to examine a design at various phases in the development process. So it's a very crunchy lens, but it's very applicable to what we're talking about today. So for the sake of today's conversation, can you provide for us Will's overview of how these filters play a role in evaluating your game design decisions?
Oh, yeah. So it's a big list. And yeah, the 8 filters are essentially trying to answer the "is your game good?" question that we all have. Do you like your game? Will your audience like your game? Will it sell? Is it even possible to make on a technical level? Does anyone who has played it enjoy it once it does get made? I think Jesse Schell really gave us something there by lumping them all together, because for me, it really encapsulates the gut instinct that you develop as a game designer throughout your professional career. You will get a feeling in certain phases of development that something's off in what you're making, but then you have to answer the question of what is off and how is it off? Are we worried that it's not going to sell? Are we worried that we haven't tested it enough? You can't possibly know if you're passing through all of the 8 at every single phase of production, but you can identify which of the 8 is potentially the biggest problem right now in this moment. And that's a lot of what good game direction is. Out of all the problems we have, which one are we going to focus on today?
This feels to me like you go to your auto mechanic and he pulls out a code reader and he plugs it into the computer, and the code reader brings up, okay, here's the general problem based on the code that came up, and they have an idea what to go and dig further into. It kind of feels like the game design's version of that.
Yeah, we know there's some problem with the brakes, for example, but Is it the brake pad, the rotors? Is it the actual mechanism to actually apply pressure to the brake that's failed? Is there a lack of fluid? That's what the 8 filters are helping you narrow down into. Yeah. Something is off, so ask yourself these 8 questions, and the answer might come to the surface.
Do you feel there's too early of a phase to use these? Can these be used in ideation, creating slice, early development, all throughout?
100%. I think all of the 8 are useful in every phase. You don't necessarily know which of the 8 is the most useful at any given moment. But even when you're sitting down to create the bare bones idea of the game, you want to be asking yourself those questions. Do we want to make it? Does our audience want us to make it? Can we even make it? Is it even possible? obviously, like testing, you haven't done anything, so there's nothing to test, but how are you going to approach testing this time around? When do you want to incorporate testing?
Yeah.
How do you want to divide up testing responsibility? Those sorts of questions, those all go into how you plan a big project out.
Using this lens really gives you a holistic view. Like it kind of puts producer hat on for a second and goes, okay, let's look at the whole thing here.
Yeah, it's a holistic framework for looking at your project.
Okay, well, let's narrow it in for a second. Content design, this is your wheelhouse. How do you apply the 8 filters? You're designing a level or a quest or something very specific. Do they all apply there? Do you care about marketing when you're designing a level or a quest?
So in content, levels and quests and writing, you're really at the rubber hits the road of the game. The mechanics of the game, the technical execution of the game, the aesthetics of the game really come into focus when you're telling the player what to do and you're giving them tasks. So when you work in content, if any part of the game feels off, you hear about it. Someone doesn't like your level, but it actually turns out they really just don't like jumping. Right? The jump mechanic is off. Like, oh, I don't like your level. It's too hard. And then you're like, oh, well, we have this really difficult, the jump mechanic is too hard. And we built a platformer. And so people don't like our levels.
Right.
So you're at the mercy of the experience design and the playtesting filters. Not exclusively, but that's the majority of your pain. What you need to look at when you're doing level and quest. You need to know if what you're doing makes sense and feels well paced. If you love your level, but everyone gets lost and doesn't know where to go, that's not good. And if you're doing a quest that immediately sends you to some extremely difficult area of the game and everyone dies and never finishes the quest, that's bad too.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is sometimes the filters come up in surprising ways. There's the social community filter, for example, and it might be easy to overlook that one, but sometimes you have a higher purpose to what you're making. One of the real key experiences for me at Bethesda was we had Make-A-Wish recipients that would come tour the studio, and the team would always get really excited, and sometimes we would be at the right phase of a project to like make things for them and put them in the game. And that was just for one person. It wasn't for any particular other need of the project or its long-term plans. It was just something we wanted to do to make that special for one person. So it's impossible to quantify the effect that has on a project, but it makes it really special.
That's cool. That's powerful. Okay, let's put a pin in that particular lens and move on to the last one. The lens of functional space. So this is concrete. This is very applicable to level design. So in your opinion, what defines functional space in the context of digital game design, particularly, as I said, in relation to levels and quests?
Sure, we can start with levels because that's the easier one. The level at some point, at some lens of design is just the geometry. Are you moving forward? Are you going right? Are you going up or down? And so you can use functional space to strip everything else out and just look at that. So constant problem in level design is navigation. People are getting lost. So let's just look at the geometry with no other set dressing or theming. Let's just look at the space. So is it bigger than other spaces? Is it 4 times as big or 10 times as big? Then it might be that people are getting lost because they're not used to navigating that large of a space in relation to other spaces in the game.
Right.
Does it have a lot of looping paths? And so you lose a sense that you're moving forward, or you don't actually know what direction that you're going in. Do you have rooms with a lot of different entry points? And so you lose a sense of where you came from and where you're going. So those are all navigational problems, regardless of anything else that the space is trying to do, the encounters in the space or the puzzles or the loot in the space. So that's taking the functional lens to it. What is the actual geometry achieving? For quest design, functional space is really doing something similar, but it's asking what is the player verb outside of the story and characters? What is the discrete task we're asking you to do, the actual activity? So is it talk to a person? Is it travel to a space? Is it fight this thing and win? Are we doing one of those things with no other variation too often? Are we always defaulting to fighting something? Are we talking to a person, but then talk to another person, then talk to a third person? Do we even have enough verbs? Are 3 verbs enough to create meaningful content? And my favorite counterexample to this is Disco Elysium, because it's totally fascinating to me because they only have one verb, which is talking. You click on a thing and there's dialogue, and you click on that thing and it's dialogue. And from the functional space lens, that looks really boring. But that's the power of really good writing. Writing helps you make the same verb feel fresh. And we have a limited number of verbs in any game, sometimes maybe just one. And writing and other parts of the experience can help make that verb feel like you're doing something else, even though on a functional level, you're doing the same thing.
Right. In something like a shooter like Starfield, where does the consideration between creating an engaging and interesting space to fight, have a firefight cover and movement and paths and stuff, versus having something that's pleasing to the eye and easy to look at and easy to understand where the path of traffic should be? And where do you find the balance there?
That's really hard. That's the art of it. And I think we'll have those arguments forever. There were always, I don't want to say fights, it's more like discussions, sometimes heated discussions, because people are very passionate about this stuff.
Yeah.
You like, aesthetically, this looks ugly. No, I need all of this cover in the space because there's a lot of shooting and I don't want you to die and I want all this pacing. Why do you have this giant puzzle that takes up the entire room? I always die in it. It looks ugly because you put all these hideous acid traps everywhere or whatever. That's one of the, I actually want to say it's one of the joys of working with a team, especially a team with different skill sets like art versus, level design versus level art, is you have people that can challenge you and can give you that perspective. Hey, I know you're trying to achieve this thing design-wise, but it looks ugly. That's something that may not occur to you as the designer. You're worried about the functional goals, the game mechanics, the pacing of activity. And it takes someone with an artistic mindset and background to say, hey, you can do that, but you can also make sure that the snowy end cap of the glorious mountain tomb looks awesome and makes you feel like you're an actual Norse Viking going up to meet the gods or whatever.
Love it. Environmental storytelling tools would probably also play in, like the whole yellow paint to tell you which direction to go and using weenies and lights to tell you where you should be going. Is that all part of the same kind of consideration?
Oh, yeah. That's a whole art in and of itself, is that visual design and direction. How do we worry about the consistency of objects? There's an entire sort of literature in combat design over character silhouettes, for example.
Oh, wow.
Right? Especially in hero shooters, the ability to know who you're facing immediately is very important, especially if you have a very high kinetic moment-to-moment experience, like Overwatch.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously the other classic thing in game designs is the big red barrel that you shoot to blow up.
Right.
But this is also goes to things like the loot chest. If you have a chest in the game, people are going to think there's something good in there.
Yep.
Because we're just we've experienced this over and over again. So yeah, the design of something and the expected activity of that design is really important.
Cool. Well, that's kind of an overview of the 4 lenses and how Will applies them for level and quest design. I guess let's wrap that section up with kind of a summary here. I guess if you were to take those 4 lenses and you were just to consider them as a whole, how do these principles here encapsulate how to create a compelling player experience, in your opinion?
Yeah. For me, it's all about the pacing. whether it's rewards that you're giving out to the player, whether it's story and how much to tell of it in any given moment, or what new things we're going to introduce, what new problems to solve. Whenever you're laying out a level, planning a quest flow, you have to keep in mind what are the major experiences you're trying to create, and how do we give those experiences room to land. You have to notice how much you're putting in front of your audience at any given moment. And you always want to be thinking about how do you build a bridge between the experience that you want them to have versus the experience they actually have when they play it.
Nice. Wisdom right there, buddy. Wisdom from Will. It's applicable to the digital games that you work on, but also I'm thinking in my head, I'm working on designing a scenario for my home game tabletop, and also very applicable. I have to design a cave. I have to be considerate of the functional space. I've got to be thinking about the problems they're solving and the value. Like, it's all there, man. It's cool.
Yeah, and whenever you're telling a story, whenever you want to do a tone shift, it's also really important. If you have, say, a very comedic kind of campaign that you're running, and all of a sudden you want to go into a character's tragic background or whatnot, you have to come off of the comedic high tone and actually give some space and then ramp into the tragedy. There can be sudden shifts that you can do on purpose, but you really have to know that you're doing them on purpose and how that jolt is going to affect people. Otherwise, you really have to be careful about the transition.
Love it. Good stuff, man. All right, well, that's the lenses. So before we start heading kind of towards the door, let's do some fun stuff. I've asked you my question before, the question I ask everybody that comes on the show, my philosophical question. It lives at the heart of the show. I have your answer to it, but I am kind of curious if you've thought about it, if you've come up with a new answer, and just in case some people haven't heard it before, the question is, in my opinion, there's a magical space at the intersection of corner of story and game, comic book writing, improv, all these things, where we can all just hang out, get together. There's a shared language. If you agree with me, in your opinion, what is the thread that holds all that together?
So I have given this more thought. So I do have an expanded answer.
Nice.
I think at some level, anything that's magical or sacred is about connecting with other people. So your corner of narrative and gameplay being magical question, I think what you're really asking is, when does a game feel like a statement from someone else? Something that connects you to the person who made it. So Hades 2 just came out, and those games really feel like you know the person who made them, even though you don't, and it was a whole team of people.
Yeah.
Everything feels like a person who is kinetic and in a rush and loves Greece and is, maybe a little thirsty. There's a lot of lovely portrayed Greek deities, but the game on some level almost feels like a friend. And that's only possible because you love the world, you love the characters, but you also love the activity that you're sharing with it. And that's true of your own friendships. It's not that you know them and you have history or that you do activities with them. You really have to be doing both. So even our families, we tend to spend time with them around a shared activity, like a meal or watching a movie or television together. And then interwoven with that is conversation about our lives and our day. So that weaving of story and activity is kind of fundamental to human connectivity and the human experience. So I think that might be sort of what you're getting at.
That is a fantastic answer, buddy.
Nice.
All right. Well, we're going to start pushing for the door, but let's do our quick fire first. And I've changed up the couple questions for you, something a little different. First one is, what do you listen to when you write or work?
I listen to whatever song gets stuck in my head, and then I loop it for hours until I'm done writing. So lately, it's been U2's, I still haven't found what I'm looking for, but it's the cover version from the Sing 2 movie with Scarlett Johansson. I have no idea how that got there, but I've now listened to that for 4 hours straight while I've been writing, and and it's not out of my head yet. So,
Oh, dude.
I know.
Okay. All right, next one. If your essence was distilled down perfectly and translated into a game, whether it's tabletop role-playing, whether it's a video game, whatever, A, what system or world or game would it be? And B, what race, class, character would you be?
I'd say right now I'd pick White Wolf's Mage, The Ascension.
Nice.
This is me, although I will admit I have never actually played a game of it, despite reading it. It's one of those. Everyone has a couple of role-playing games that they always want to play but never have for some reason. But I love the game and the setting, and I love the idea of being some time mage who's trying to decide between the past, present, and the future.
Nice. Oh, dude. Now I just want to fire up some online platform and run a game for you. Mage was my kick back in the day, back in my early 20s. I love that game.
It's such a cool idea. The idea of, be careful, don't break reality, please.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it. It was the first game I played where there was like repercussions for the use of magic in a mechanical way, which was so cool.
Yeah, it's such a cool system.
So that's kind of the quick fires. What are you working on? Anything apart from? We've mentioned Word Song. Everybody needs to watch Something Wicked Games and keep your eye on them for the next couple of years, however long it takes, because that's going to be magical. But is there anything else? Where can people find you online? What's happening?
Oh yeah, I am Will Shen 101 on most of the social media platforms. And I spoke at the Game Developers Conference with my longtime colleague, Darrell Brigner. So I think that our talk is actually available publicly.
Oh,
so if you're tooling around on the GDC public talks, you could probably find ours. And in terms of other recent work, although I didn't work on the Fallout TV show, I did work on some Fallout games. So if you enjoyed the TV show, check out that Fallout 4 and that Fallout 4 for Harbor and, give it a whirl.
Right on. The numbers of people playing those games certainly went up after the show, eh? That was
cool?
Crazy.
Yeah. That's the power of media in our lives. I was blown away by when that happened to the Cyberpunk games.
Mm-hmm.
Edge Runners anime series on Netflix, which is an incredible series, by the way. So it really shows you that great IPs stick with you. You think about them even when you're not playing, and if there's other great media out there for them, then it works great.
I never played League before, but after Arcane came out, I played League. Yeah. Arcane was so good.
So good.
All right, man. Well, it's time for me to close up shop. So as we head out the door, do you have any parting words of wisdom for us? You can have the final word.
Oh, thank you. So I said this last time, but I think it's worth saying again. The art doesn't lie. Whoever you are will show up in your work. But that's a statement to yourself as much as anyone else. Don't be afraid to look at your work and ask yourself why you made it and who you really made it for. And your work isn't the only statement you're making to the world. Your whole life is. Don't be afraid to ask yourself how you want to live. And it's okay if your message is just your existence. That's a great quote from Gandhi, actually. My life is my message. So think about that the next time you sit down and make something.
Well, that crowd of unruly pirates that I was hoping would skip our tavern this evening seemed to be filling up the space, so it's probably in everybody's best interest that we move along. Before I push you out the door, though, I want to say thank you to Will for sitting down and once again sharing your hard-earned wisdom and insight. And of course, to you, dear listener, thank you for taking your seat at the table. Until we meet again, keep creating, exploring, and sharing stories with the world. Stay safe out there, Wanderer. Your chair will be ready by the fire the next time you stop in at the Corner of Story and Game.